Hello, welcome back to the Meta-Humanism podcast. This week's episode will be focusing on the particularly Ukrainian synthesis of Western humanism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Or rather, I will be introducing that subject because we need to go over some historical background before we actually look at the synthesis itself and examine its nuances. So, in one of the introductory episodes to this channel, I summarized, which was called "What is Humanism?" I summarized the history of Western humanism, which emerged during the Renaissance in Italy and then spread northward to the British Isles, the Netherlands, the Dutch humanism, and farther. That story is pretty well known in the world. That's the mainstream story of the humanism. But what is much less well known is and understood even to this day is how outside of the specialist circles and the actual people from those from Eastern Europe, how this Western humanist philosophy influenced the Eastern European traditions, which have always been distinct from the Western Catholic Christianity, the Orthodox civilization. So that is what we will look at today, focusing specifically on the Ukrainian case. What follows will highlight the different developmental paths taken in history by the early modern Ukrainians and Belarusians on one hand, and the early modern Russians on the other hand. I already discussed how Muscovy, the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, which falsely appropriated the legacy of the medieval state of Rus, and deliberately renamed itself the Russian Empire in the 18th century. For context, I strongly suggest, if you haven't yet, to watch my two episodes I recorded earlier, one on the Russian historical imperialist myths and one on propagandist lies since the war on Ukraine started in 2014. So those will give you some context for this discussion that follows. So, by way of brief, as brief as we can make it, historical overview, let's remind ourselves some of the important historical events and dates that are relevant for this discussion. So, first I want to discuss the preconditions of the Great Schism between Orthodoxy and Catholicism within Christianity, which developed gradually over the centuries, but usually is dated to 1054, is when the official split happened, and I will explain what that means. But the split was actually a result of complex combination of theological, ecclesiological, political, cultural, and linguistic differences. So we'll go over them quickly, briefly, just for context, so we know what we're talking about and have some background context for the Ukrainian situation. So in the between 1st and 9th centuries, so that's the Roman Empire is declined and breaks up. And the new in Europe kind of fractures also because the Western Roman Empire is invaded and defeated by the Goths, and so new Germanic tribes and states emerge, and in the east of Europe, Slavic states also start emerging. Including Rus, which is a medieval state of which future Ukrainians, Belarusians, and partly Russians as well. So, the linguistic divides between the Latin West, the Western Roman Empire, and the Eastern Byzantine Empire, which continues to go on after the Rome is sacked by the Goths. So the West used Latin more, the East used Greek language more, and there were also cultural political divides. Roman legal structure and system, it's famous and it's still a legacy in today in Europe. The traces of Roman law influenced the development of law in Western Europe, and by extension in their colonies. They conquered down the line during the early modern and modern times. So that Roman legalism is contrasted to Byzantine synthesis of empire and church. something known as Caesaro-papism. So Caesar as an emperor, papal also authority as a leader of the church, and it's merged in Byzantine tradition. It was merged, so the emperor was also the head of the church, and the patriarch, and so that model was also later adopted by the Russian Empire, which is an important point to make. And they styled themselves as the Third Rome eventually. So first Rome is a Roman Empire, second Rome is Byzantine, Constantinople, or today Istanbul of the Byzantine Empire. That was the second Rome, and then Moscow decided to pretend that it is a third Rome, or it deserves to be the third Rome, or it is the third Rome, and that ideology is with us till this day. So late 9th century. About 867 to 880s, there was a schism between within Christianity called Photian Schism, and that's after Patriarch Photius from Constantinople. Tensions over papal authority and missionary control of the Slavs, especially in Bulgaria and Moravia, but also later Rus states. So those contested, much of those lands were pagan until late, so we will discuss that depending on which part of Eastern Europe we're talking about. They were mostly pagan until late in, I would say, 9th century, 9th, 10th century. So Bulgarians, Moravians, and then the Rus, the state of Rus, which was kind of reached its heyday in 10th century. So there were these Eastern European lands were contested between Rome and the Byzantine Empire, the Constantinople, each wanting to influence and to control and to have more authority in that within those lands. So between Patriarch Photius and Pope Nicholas I, that emerged a schism, and it was overcome. It didn't cause the ultimate rift yet at that time in the 9th century. So Christianity stayed united, at least formally, but it was the precursor of the Great Schism in the 11th century in 1054. So all the issues kind of emerged during those in the 9th century, all the important issues, which were diverging practices, for example, clerical celibacy in the West versus married priests in the East, and liturgical differences, linguistic differences, and so on. So this kind of further entrenched cultural separation in the 9th and 10th century and led up to the 11th century Great Schism. So also in the 10th century, towards the end of the 10th century, in 988, Volodymyr the Great of Rus, considering his options, he considered Rome, he considered Constantinople, Byzantine Rite, he considered some other options available at the time, I believe, but he decided to choose Byzantine Christianity and the Constantinople as the official religion for medieval state of Rus. And he Christianized Rus, and that's an important kind of milestone in the history of Eastern Europe. Christianity comes to the one of the strongest, or not one, the strongest Slavic state, Rus, becomes Christian. So it's important. This amalgam of paganism and Christianity, there's a lot of traditions within the Ukrainian, even Christianity. A lot of traditions still carry the imprint of the paganism, and you kind of scratch the Christian traditions, and you find the paganist kind of under soil, if you will. This kind of it's all grounded in this pre-Christian beliefs, but Christianity kind of was laid over them, and there was some synthesis found, and gradually Ukraine became fully Orthodox Christian. Well, at the time when it was Christianized, there was no Orthodoxy versus Catholicism yet, but ultimately that would emerge in the 11th century when Pope Leo IX sent one of his cardinals and a bunch of legates, so ambassadors, to Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and excommunicated Patriarch Michael I, who was based in Constantinople. And Patriarch Michael I, in turn, excommunicated the papal delegation, and this was, although this was seen as a temporary measure, nobody intended this to last forever at the time. It became symbolic of the final break between the Eastern Orthodoxy and the Western Catholicism. And that rift continues to this day. It's really a civilizational divide. And that's what is often meant when we say Ukraine is between the East and the West. Because it became Orthodox. It became connected to the Byzantine Rite, and so it was Orthodox, but then it was on the, always was on the, and as our next thing we will look at will show, it was always on the edge between the West and the East, and we'll examine that in a minute. So just to go over some of the important dimensions of that Great Schism. So first was papal authority, so that's ecclesiology, meaning church. Ecclesia means church, so ecclesiology means who is in charge of the church, the bureaucracy, the institutions. So the West, the Roman Catholicism, will become called Catholicism, claimed universal jurisdiction for the Pope as successor of Peter, apostle of the Christ, with authority over all Christendom, right? So, and they still claim that today. And the East, Constantinople and others, recognized the Pope as first among equals, so they didn't exactly deny that the Pope had some religious authority within Christianity, but they rejected papal supremacy. They preferred conciliar or synodal governance, so not just governance by one central location, but by a synod or council of churches. So various Eastern Rite churches there are, I don't know, Syrian, Maronite, this, that. I don't have the list in my head, but for example, you Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, this. So all of these different churches had their own churches, controlled their own kind of autocephalous called. So cephal is head, so self-governing churches, but then they would gather in a synod or a council and make important decisions for everybody in terms of, let's say, rituals or liturgy or something else, or theology. So that was one, papal authority. Second issue was filioque clause. Filioque is from Latin, and it means "and from the Son." So the idea that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and from the Son. Originally, it said the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, from God. And then the Western edition was in the Nicene Creed in the 4th or 5th century. They added "and from the Son." Which the Eastern churches rejected this change. It was done unilaterally by the Roman church, and the Eastern Church rejected it, both theologically. They consider it to be a distortion of Trinity, the concept and balance of Trinity, and canonically. So meaning that it was an authorized alteration of an ecumenical creed. Ecumenical meaning oikumene is like the community, right? So ecumenical means for the whole community, and they viewed it as an usurpation of power by Rome to change something without consulting other churches, self-governing churches in the world. So that was the second point. Third was liturgy and ritual. West used Latin, as I said, developed scholastic theology. Scholastic means we can examine it maybe in some of the future episodes more carefully, but that was from proceeding from Aristotelian principles, some of and then developed and integrated into the church arguments and theology. And so it emphasized rational clarity and legal frameworks. That was the focus. And East used Greek, and some local languages like Church Slavonic. So for Ukraine, that is relevant, Church Slavonic. It was specifically language designed for church use, and it was not like a living language spoken by the people, but more clerical language, Church Slavonic. And so it developed in the medieval times and retained mystical theology. So it wasn't just rational based, it was mystical theology and liturgical symbolism. So more, less rational, less constrained to just rationality and legalism, but also allowing for some mystical or less rational or intuitive insights and symbolic, so mythology, you could say. So other contested practices were the use of the kind of bread they used for Eucharist, for communion. The Roman Catholicism was used unleavened bread, meaning no yeast was added, so it didn't grow. It's a different kind of bread. And the Eastern churches used leavened bread, so those that are grow and like a typical bread you can think of, that you add yeast to it so it grows when it is baked. So, and that because it's seen as living, something living, yeast is a living organism, right? And so it's added to the bread, and it adds life to bread, and so it was seen as living symbol. And the Western Catholicism went a different way, and so that was an important distinction. Clerical celibacy I already mentioned, and then fasting regulations and the way you do the sign. Like in Eastern, you do this way. In the West, people do it this way, right? So minor. It's like a narcissism, minor differences. If you just look at some of these things, at least on the surface. They connect to deeper meanings, but on the surface it seems silly to. But it's just one of the differences. Number 4, so that was a papal authority, liturgy, a filioque clause about the Trinity, and then the liturgy and ritual. And the 4th now is political and cultural tensions. So the crowning of Charlemagne in 800 as a Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope was perceived in Constantinople as a challenge to Byzantine authority. So that was just a pragmatic kind of power struggle. And the fall of Western Roman Empire, which I said it was sacked by Goths, the rise of Byzantium as the Christian imperial center created these diverging imperial theological models, which I already mentioned, and kind of the different civilizational outlooks and worldviews. And the final factor was language and philosophical approach. Latin in the West favored legal systematic theology. People you can think of are St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas are prominent theologians in the Western tradition. And then Greek was used in the East and favored mystical contemplative theology. Some of the writers or thinkers in this tradition are the Cappadocian theologians, Maximus the Confessor, and some others. I'm not a specialist, so these are just some references for you. Translation differences also help to bring this rift in theological vocabulary. It's like categories like substance, essence, person, and from some of the Aristotelian categories where distinctions of different ways of looking at the world kind of emerged out of it in the West and in the East, and so further widened misunderstandings in theology. So despite some of the attempts made to reunite the churches following this 1054 rift and mutual excommunication, they all failed. In the subsequent centuries, they all failed. And so the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople was sacked during that crusade, also kind of didn't help anything, damaged relations for even further. So there was no coming back from that schism. and it persists to this day. Orthodoxy versus Catholicism within Christianity, and then later Protestantism emerged as a third, as another challenge to Catholicism within Catholicism, really, but that also affected Orthodoxy, which we'll discuss next. So just to summarize this part so far. Between Western and Eastern Christianity, the papal authority for Western Christianity, Catholic, is supreme and universal. For Eastern Christianity or Orthodox, first among equals, no more, no less. Filioque clause, so the spirit proceeding from the God and the Son. Western Christianity accepted that. Eastern Christianity rejected that idea. So even today, within the Eastern Rite Christianity, Orthodox, and Ukrainian Catholic, which is Eastern Rite, which we'll discuss in a minute, it is said the spirit proceeds from the God, not from the God and the Son. Okay, clerical celibacy. Western Catholicism is mandatory. In Orthodoxy, it's optional, and there are parish priests who are married, and it's not a problem. Eucharist, bread, so communion, unleavened for Catholicism, leavened for Orthodoxy. Language and culture, Latin and juridical for Catholicism, and Greek, Slavonic, and mystical for Eastern Orthodoxy. Theology, more scholastic and legalistic for Western Catholicism, and more apophatic and experiential for Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So apophatic means inability to know God for truly. So it's more theology focusing on what God isn't than saying what God is. It's a complicated concept. We'll examine it maybe in the future episodes dedicated to philosophy of religion more specifically. And lastly, church structure is very centralized in Western Catholicism, and conciliar or autocephalous, synodal in Eastern Orthodoxy. So you see these differences along all these dimensions created this rift, which persists to this day. Okay, so that's happened, and fast forward to the 15th century when the Renaissance emerges in the Western Catholic world, and presents a challenge because they start questioning the dominance of religion and so on. We discussed this before. I won't repeat it. And also in the 15th century, in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottomans. So that's the end of the Byzantine Empire and the predominance of Orthodox kind of empire, this kind of power vacuum is created in the Orthodox world because Constantinople is now occupied by the Ottomans, and it becomes the center of the Ottoman Empire, right? And then in the 16th century, Reformation also starts again within the Western world, within the Catholicism, with Martin Luther, and Counter-Reformation, which is a reaction of the Catholic Church against this Protestant challenge, and connected to the Jesuits, the activity of Jesuits most prominently. And the latter, this Counter-Reformation, was pretty much Catholic Church trying to reassert its global dominance. So that presented a challenge for Orthodoxy on the liminal, so on the edges of Catholicism, where Catholicism or Orthodoxy kind of interacted, or Orthodoxy couldn't ignore and had to contest with the Counter-Reformation activities of the Jesuits. And Ukraine is one of such lands where these Jesuits were pretty active, and that's the next thing to look at, is because Ukraine, the lands that are today Ukraine, and the people who are today modern Ukrainians, in the 16th century, they were most of them were in the state called Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and there was also the Polish Kingdom, and the Polish Kingdom was Catholic, firmly Catholic, still is Catholic, very Catholic till this day. Lithuania adopted, it was pagan first, but then it adopted Orthodoxy from the Ukrainians, Ruthenians, they were called Ruthenians, which are Ukrainians and Belarusians at that time. They weren't separated yet. So, and the Lithuanian ruling elite, which controlled the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, they took on many of the customs of the Ruthenians that they were ruling over, which is Orthodoxy and also some of the non-religious customs as well. So they become kind of Ruthenized in a way. But in 1569, these two states, the Lithuanian state and the Polish crown, decided to join forces. They actually had already had a common monarch since the 1385, the Union of Cravo. It was a personal union, so it was just on the level of monarchy. There was a common monarch, but they were, ruled separately. It was just two different states, just a common monarch. It was common in those days. But in 1569, that dynasty, Jagiellonian dynasty that was ruling both states, was nearing extinction, and so the political elites were looking for a new solution. And they found it in creating this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Union of Lublin in 1569 was the legal act that created this union. It was created both because of this, as I said, the dynasty was dying out. There were external threats. The the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, which later renamed the Russian Empire, was expanding aggressively at the time. The Crimean Tatars and the Ottoman Empire also were military threats that needed to be accounted for. So a tighter union between the two states of Poland and Lithuania was seen as necessary for common defense and survival. Kind of like what Europe is facing today in the face of Russian threat again. Common defense is important. So internal pressures also contributed. The Polish nobility wanted greater influence over Lithuanian affairs, and the Lithuanian nobility was kind of afraid that would mean political and economical submission to the Polish culture and customs, but they were divided internally, so they weren't able, unfortunately, I don't know, unfortunately, but they weren't at the time able to resist in any way. So this union did happen, but Polish kind of nobility was dominant in that union. Is the point. What the outcomes of that union was, it created one of the largest and most populous states in Europe at the time. It consolidated elite noble democracy because the union, it was a constitutional union, meaning that the nobility had rights and the king was elected. And so it was an early example of a kind of proto-democratic state in Europe, with the power concentrated in the nobility. What in Polish it's called szlachta, and in Ukrainian that word also got rooted, szlachta, and provided a framework for religious and ethnic pluralism, because again, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, even some paganism maybe in there, and it allowed for some pluralism, but there were still tensions. So that's important to understand. The tensions were there. It was not all seamless and smooth, but there was some pluralism at least agreed upon. The Ukrainian lands were now under Polish rule, and experienced, as a result of this union, started experiencing attempts to Latinize and Polonize it. So again, because of the Byzantine influence, it was more Greek-based and more Orthodox, based. And now there was this forces, Polish, very Catholic, very Latin-based culture was trying to change what the customs in Ukraine and Belarus, and so these Orthodox Ruthenians became politically marginalized, and this ultimately led to the Union of the Brest, the Union of Brest in 1596, and that's a religious union. And then the subsequent resistance to it by the Cossacks and the Orthodox elites who disagreed with this union between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, pretty much. And so the future cultural split between East and West in that region was that's the Union of Brest was a defining event. Let's look at that Union of Brest for a little bit more carefully. So the model of union proposed was based on the Council of Florence, which happened in 1439, which tried to reunite East and West, to Great Schism. That model was accepted briefly by the Byzantine officials, but rejected by the people, so it never happened. But it was used as a model for this Union of Brest. And the model was that Orthodox clergy could keep their Eastern liturgy, calendar, married clergy, and other customs like that, but they must recognize the papal supremacy and Catholic dogma. So like filioque clause, purgatory, and other things that the Eastern Orthodoxy didn't accept readily, they had to accept as a compromise. So this formula appealed to bishops in Eastern Orthodoxy, which they sought in the aftermath of the fall of Constantinople. They were looking for more stability, more recognition, protection, legitimacy. So this formula worked for them. For people, not so much. That was harder, but and it caused division. And resistance, and because not everybody accepted it. There were lay student brotherhoods emerged again after the fall of Constantinople to fill up the power vacuum a little bit. These lay societies of students and religious people, Orthodox, called brotherhoods, emerged. The Cossacks culture was also very Orthodox based. And figures like, we'll talk about the intellectual figures like Ivan Vyshinsky is one of the early proponents of Orthodoxy, Ukrainian Orthodoxy, denounced it as a betrayal, this union of Brest. So the result was a deep schism within Orthodox community. So Greek Catholics, the so-called Uniates, to which I was christened in that tradition and to which I belong, they recognized Rome, but they retained the Eastern rites. And Ukrainian Catholic Church today is exactly like that. Their liturgy is very similar to the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, but it recognizes the Pope as the supreme authority. And although we have our own kind of governance structure, the head of our church, Ukrainian Catholic Church, is considered kind of like one of the cardinals of not exactly the same, but sort of like a cardinal to the Pope. He's subordinated to the Pope, but has a certain amount of self-governance. So and then there were the quote-unquote real Orthodox people who rejected this union and who reorganized with the help from the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Cossacks. So there was this rift kind of introduced in Ukrainian culture, in what today is Ukraine. Obviously, this rift influenced because part of what today is Ukraine was became uniate and controlled more by Poles. And then those who resisted, like Cossacks and those who were backed by the Constantinople church, opposed this Polish attempt to dominate. And so this rift, this cultural and civilizational rift, was introduced. So from here, the next chapter we want to examine is how. So let me just recap this dynamic. So there was a rift between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, East and West, and then when the Reformation began, the Protestantism as a challenge to Catholicism, to Western Christianity. Catholicism reacted with Counter-Reformation, trying to spread its influence and legitimize it further, or re-legitimize it against Protestantism. And Ukraine, which was Orthodox initially, fully Orthodox, became, because of Polish-Lithuanian Union in Lublin in 1569, and then also because of the Union of Brest in 1596, within a short period of time, had to grapple with this influence from the West, which included Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Renaissance ideas, humanist ideas, and to somehow adapt it to their Orthodox beliefs and traditions, and find some kind of compromise or synthesis, right? So that's what spurred on the Ukrainian Humanist Orthodoxy. That's the synthesis we're going to be examining in the next episode. Today we're just looking at the preconditions. And now I want to contrast that development, that complex interplay of different traditions and different currents of thought and philosophies and theologies, to what the path taken by the Muscovy or later Russian Empire. So this, which was more isolationist and less, and it didn't grapple with the developments in the Western European culture, civilization, and it stayed frozen in the past. And it's that way till this day, and so this is important. So the Renaissance and Reformation slash Counter-Reformation dynamic, which followed and accompanied was followed, or you could say accompanied, by the Baroque culture and then the Enlightenment culture later on. It took two paths, right? So this interaction between all those Western produced cultural currents and the Eastern traditions. Ukrainian synthesis of this Western humanism and the Reformation ideas, and Eastern Orthodoxy, trying to accommodate these new ideas and find a way to move forward, versus the Muscovite imperialist ideology of the Third Rome, which I already mentioned. The Rome, Constantinople, and then Moscow as the third Rome, third imperial center. So just a quick summary of the cultural, philosophical, and theological developments in Muscovy itself between 14th and 17th centuries. We will be looking at Ukrainian synthesis a lot more in the future episodes. So I want to just summarize the contrast and contrast the path taken by Moscow. Theological orientation was it emphasized Byzantine monastic orthodoxy, particularly transmitted through Mount Athos, which is in Greece, monastery, one of the oldest monasteries in the tradition to this day, and Balkan traditions also, like Bulgaria and others. So that was the dominant ideal, and the Holy Russia idea of the Holy Russia as the third Rome was established during this time in the 15th, 16th centuries. And also Moscow embarked on expansionist policies, imperialist policies during this time as well. Deep suspicion towards scholasticism, so Aristotelian scholasticism, Latin theology as well, and Western rationalism. Deep suspicion to this day. Philosophy and education. No indigenous humanist tradition similar to Renaissance existed in Russia, in Moscow at that time. Education continued to be monastic, oral, and liturgical mostly. Printing, classical learning, and rhetoric arrived very late and often via Ukrainian clergy, educated at one of the academies. There was Ostrog and Kyiv-Mohyla academies, which we will examine in greater detail. They were both Orthodox, and they tried to create this synthesis of Orthodoxy and humanism. And those ideas then were transmitted to Moscow only through Ukrainian attempts at synthesis, and then partially they were transmitted to Moscow as well through certain figures which we'll discuss, religious figures and church leaders. So cultural ethos was strongly imperial, ascetic, collectivist, in a way despotic. I told you about Caesaro-Papism, where the empire and the church are kind of fused. There's no distinction, no separation of church and state. Excuse me. There's a lot of emphasis on the empire and collective dimension, no individualism, which is part of humanist legacy. So iconography, chants, and Old Church Slavonic remain central into this day. It's Old Church Slavonic is used in Russian Orthodox churches, which is a lot less comprehensible than the language used in vernacular language used in Ukrainian churches or Belarusian. Aversion to vernacularization. Vernacularization means when Europe during Protestant times especially started transitioning from fully dominated culture dominated by Latin to culture dominated by national languages, local languages, vernacular. So that the resistance to that was very deep in Russia. And individual expression in theology or literature was also resisted in Russia. So while Ukraine was developing this hybrid spiritual humanism, through the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. So the Union of Brest was the hybrid solution to find some way forward to preserve Eastern ritual, putting it under papal authority. Kind of that was a hybrid solution, and that already kind of defined the experience and the Ukrainian culture kind of existing in this hybrid environment and trying to grapple with many different currents of thought at the same time. And so poetic literature, conciliar theology, meaning, council-based theology, not centralized. Muscovy, on the other hand, pursued this more imperial, sacral path, more like Byzantine, emperor, sacred emperor, theocracy in a way, and focused on autocracy, mystical traditionalism, and Byzantine-style isolation, resisting both Western influences and local innovation. So kind of frozen in time. And just to summarize very briefly, so theological openness. In Muscovy, there was no openness. It was isolationist and defensive orthodoxy, full on. In Ukraine, synthesis of orthodoxy with Western humanism. Philosophical development in Muscovy, very minimal. Mystical monastic emphasis remained. In Ukraine, rational, poetic, and symbolic humanism of somebody we will definitely look very carefully at, Grigory Skovoroda, known as Ukrainian Socrates. He was kind of a culmination of this humanist synthesis, and then he influenced future generations. Cultural style in Muscovy, it was imperial, monastic, static, eternal empire. In Ukraine, it was Baroque culture was predominant, dialogical, kind of in dialogue with these various Western traditions, and plural. Within Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there was pluralism, and so it infected the culture. Language, in Russian, Muscovy, archaic Church Slavonic is preserved to this day. In Ukraine, even then, Ruthenian vernacular was beginning to be introduced. Church Slavonic was also used. Latin was also introduced because of the Union. So a much more plural environment, linguistically. Educational model, in Muscovy, monastic and manual. In Kyiv-Mohyla, in Ukrainian tradition, Kyiv-Mohyla classical and rhetorical curriculum, and Skovoroda, which I mentioned, he was educated in that tradition. Ostrog is another academy, which was, we discussed those two. Attitude towards the West, so in Muscovy, hostile and protectionist completely, and that paranoia still exists to this day. And in the Ukrainian tradition, more engaged, more selective, so taking some things, borrowing some things, but rejecting others depending on what they are, adaptive. So trying to find some kind of solution or synthesis to move forward with history. So this is a Renaissance humanism in Muscovy was rejected completely or unknown even until very late. And there was no native humanist movement, as I mentioned already. Classical learning was seen as unnecessary and dangerous. In Ukrainian tradition, Kievan elite circles embraced humanism. Classical languages, rhetoric, ethics, educational reforms were instituted, in which I mentioned Ostrog and Kyiv-Mohyla academies were prominent in those times. So that's also important to highlight. In terms of Reformation and Counter-Reformation, again, Muscovy was mostly unaffected at all. Reformation was just seen as further Western fragmentation, confirming Orthodoxy's superiority from their point of view. In Ukraine, it affected Ukrainian culture deeply. This because conflict with Catholic and Unionist pressure led to Orthodox revival using Jesuit methods, so rhetoric schools, but for Orthodoxy. So that dynamic, more dynamic situation, more pluralism, and so required more active approach. You couldn't just pretend you're better than everybody else and your eternal tradition is superior. What Moscow did. So Catholic scholasticism, so Aristotelian philosophy, which was adapted to Christian theology, and Jesuit pedagogy, which is well known to this day in America. Even there are a lot of Jesuit colleges and schools, and they provide a good education. But whatever your opinion of that education is, it is a quality education, even if you don't agree with everything it teaches. It does try to provide well-rounded education. And it dates back to this Counter-Reformation. So in Russian, in Muscovy, it was rejected as foreign and heretical. Jesuit influence feared as subversive. So again, this kind of paranoid approach. In Ukrainian tradition culture, it was this Reformation, Counter-Reformation was adapted specifically by figures like Petro Mohyla, whose name is Mohyla Academy, Barry's, and Ostroh is from Konstantin Ostroysky. He was a nobleman, Orthodox nobleman, and we'll talk about him next time. The Baroque culture, again, the Muscovy, it was largely absent, the Baroque, or introduced by force by Peter I, like buildings. There's some buildings in St. Petersburg, fewer in Moscow, I believe, but it was pretty much forced from the top. It was not organic, it was not natural, it was just kind of imposed by the emperor. And aesthetic remained very different from the Baroque, very austere and Byzantine. And in Ukraine, Ukraine fully absorbed and re-thematized this within Orthodox theology. So the Baroque, the Cossack Baroque, is a famous style and cultural style, and there is the Cossack Baroque, which is distinct from the general Baroque. In Russia, there is no such thing at all. So poetry, church architecture, homiletics, meaning the homilies the priests spoke, the rhetorics they used, that all kind of was affected by the Baroque culture from the West. Visual arts, and Ivan Mazepa, who opposed Russia, who rebelled and tried to, once Russia tried to establish imperial dominance over Ukraine. Ivan Mazepa was the famous case of his rebellion against the Russian Tsar and his attempts to establish independence from Russia, and in 1709, unfortunately, he was defeated, and that started the rule of known as the Ruin in Ukrainian history. And when the Cossacks were ultimately dissolved by the Catherine II in late 18th century, and slavery or serfdom was introduced into those lands, and so on. So that was the tragic moment in history. But this we're talking about things preceding that, or kind of coterminous with it. Scientific rationalism and Enlightenment thought, again, was seen as Western deviation in Moscow, was associated with impiety, moral decay, and imported only under imperial coercion, again, imposed from the top. By Peter I, who tried to open the window to Europe, as he called it. So it was just top-down imposition, and very partial, and didn't take. In Ukraine, these Mohyla Academy and Ostroh Academy thinkers engaged with the scientific rationalism and Enlightenment thought very actively. Somebody like Teofan Prokopovich, who influenced the Russian culture as well through his... we'll examine that dynamic later, but Grigory Skovoroda, who I mentioned, also you could say he creatively subverts Enlightenment with mystical inner freedom in his thought. So we'll talk about that. Printing and vernacular literature. In Moscow, printing was tightly controlled. So again, autocracy, despotism, vernacular literature, not in Church Slavonic, was underdeveloped until much later, and church language remained very archaic, and it still remains to this day, very archaic and outdated. resisting changes. In Ukrainian tradition, strong print culture in Church Slavonic and vernacular Ruthenian used to educate and defend Orthodoxy against these more Western influences. In concept of the church, we already highlighted, but I reiterate: Caesaro-Papist in Muscovy, so church under Tsarist control. There is no separation of church and state. Patriarchy was replaced by Holy Synod by Peter I, but it was still under control of the Tsar. Tsar was the supreme authority, and then the church was subordinated to him, and the Holy Synod was just a body, I guess, a collective body, but still a single patriarch. It was reinstated eventually. So today there is a patriarch in Moscow. In Ukrainian, there was the notion of sobornost, which is conciliarity, so the council, a spiritual democracy in a way, local synods, educated clergy, dynamic theology, collective the democratic decision making, not so centralized. View of the individual in Muscovy, emphasis was on obedience, collective salvation as a group, as an empire, as a nation later, and role within hierarchical order. So know your place, don't question anything. In Ukrainian tradition, there was a lot more personal inner freedom, heart knowledge, which is connected to Skovoroda's philosophy, which will moral responsibility and so on. And there's just not just Skovoroda, but he was the most prominent and remains to this day most prominent spokesman for this kind of philosophy. A relation to the empire. Finally, in Muscovy, church became an instrument of imperial theology and remained so throughout history, even in the Soviet times, which was atheistic, formally communist. It was still the Russian Orthodox Church existed. It was infiltrated by the KGB, controlled by the state, and it remains to this day controlled by the state. And that's why this war, they treat it as holy war. They bless their tanks, their weaponry. It's a theocratic system in many ways. It doesn't really truly believe in this what they profess. Because it's been demoralized by the Soviet experience, and it's a kleptocracy. There is no spirituality. It's a hollowed out system, but it's still a theocracy in the sense that they only recognize one church, which is controlled by the state, and that's why they persecute in the occupied territories in Ukraine right now. They persecute all religious minorities, Ukrainian Catholics, Jews, Muslims, especially evangelicals, who they see as agents of the American CIA. They face the worst persecution. They torture, they kill evangelical priests, they forbid Bible study groups. It's terrible. Actually, I can recommend watching, if you can, a documentary, A Faith Under Siege, which was made by American evangelicals who went to Ukraine and saw this firsthand. Very powerful. I have nothing to do with the evangelical movement or much. I'm not very religious either, but I am a Ukrainian Catholic. I know the history of my church and how it was persecuted, and it was in the Soviet times it was outlawed, and it was functioned underground, and became legal again after the fall of the Soviet Union, and now is thriving. It's mostly in Western Ukraine because historically that's where it's based. But it has a temple or a cathedral in Kyiv, and that's where it's now central. So Ukrainian Catholicism is one of the many religious traditions within Ukraine. Ukraine is a pluralist. It doesn't persecute anybody. Except for the only church that was prohibited legally was the Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchy, because it is controlled from Moscow, and the Moscow uses the priests from that church to brainwash people and to spread its imperialist ideology. So it's a security issue, and since the war started, this Moscow Patriarchy Church was given an option to either join the Ukrainian Church, the Kyiv Patriarchy, or each parish, or dissolve, because they can't take orders from Moscow when the war is going on. So I think that that is a good place to stop for now. So just to recap the whole episode today, The Ukrainian Orthodox thinkers between 14th and 18th century, they forged this unique humanistic orthodoxy in engaging Western methods, language, logic, pedagogy, while remaining spiritually Eastern. So this interesting hybrid, you could say, or synthesis, dynamic dialogue, this resulted in a hybrid culture of learning, freedom, and inner transformation. And we'll examine the specifics of that culture in the next episode. Muscovite Orthodox leaders, by contrast, maintained a fortress theology, you could call it, defending static ritual purity and imperial unity, rejecting any Western influence unless absorbed through coercive modernization, by like what I said, like what Peter I introduced, top down. There was no bottom-up movement to grapple with the West developments in Western Europe, the Renaissance, Reformation, Counter-Reformation, scholasticism, and all the science. All of that bypassed. Moscow rejected, resisted, and continues to resist till this day. That's the background we're dealing with. Okay, I think I will end it here. Thank you for listening. As always, please support Ukraine if you're not supporting her yet. And now with the Iran getting attacked by Israel and then US, things are seemingly not cooling down. They're heating up, and who knows what will happen next. Ukraine needs your support. Don't forget about Ukraine because it's connected. Iranian drones have been killing Ukrainians for years now. So Iran is Russia's ally, and along with China, North Korea. These are really evil regimes, and it's not an exaggeration to say that. And whatever you feel about how USA or Israel behaves, I will not shed any tears for Iran, for Iran's regime. I want Iranian people to be free of theocracy. You see that theocracy is an outdated system, and Russia is also operating along the same lines. Although it's not really religious or moral, it's today because of the Soviet communist experience, it still uses the same structures of autocracy and church and state being fused and controlled by one source of power. Putin, who is quasi-czar, kleptocratic czar, but they've all, it's always been top-down autocracy, despotism, and unfortunately that's the culture and that's the civilization we're dealing with, and they will not stop until they are forced to stop. That's the sad reality of it. And so please support Ukraine, support my content if you can, and keep watching. Thank you for being with me.